As many of you will know, my name is Andrew Fagan. I'm Director of the Human Rights Centre. Thank you for joining us for this important and long-delayed event in which we pay homage to our former colleague and founding parent of the Human Rights Centre, Professor Kevin Boyle. I've been looking forward to this event for well over a year. We had first planned to hold this launch of Mike Chinoy's highly acclaimed biography of Kevin's life and momentous contributions to a variety of human rights issues last March and in person. If memory serves me correctly, this event was scheduled to take place a couple of days after St. Patrick's Day last year, which is appropriate enough. Needless to say, COVID-19 intervened and we all retreated into our respective Zoom bubbles. Not to be deterred by a global pandemic, we remain committed to rescheduling the event and to ensuring that our global community could learn more about Mike's superb and, I have to say, reasonably priced book, Kevin's contributions to human rights, and the reflections of a truly esteemed panel of people whose own human rights careers were profoundly influenced by Kevin. So here we are, albeit still cocooned within our Zoom bubbles. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Emeritus Professor Kevin Boyle, who died in 2010, was an internationally respected human rights lawyer, activist, and academic and director of our Human Rights Centre from 1990 to 2001, and again from 2006 to 2007. Prior to his arrival at Essex, Professor Boyle was among the most important figures in the Northern Ireland civil rights movement. He was co-founder of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association and the People's Democracy, the driving force behind the rent and rate strike that paralysed Northern Ireland after the introduction of internment in 1971. He proposed the Civil Rights March in Derry that became Bloody Sunday and played a crucial role as a mediator during the IRA hunger strikes of 1981. His ideas provided much of the intellectual underpinning for the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement, in turn a crucial foundation for the 1998 Good Friday Peace Agreement. Professor Boyle was also the lead lawyer in the case that decriminalised homosexuality in Northern Ireland, a reform which inspired similar moves in a number of countries. As director of Article 19, he initiated a high-profile campaign on behalf of Salman Rushdie, whose novel The Satanic Verses had resulted in a fatwa from the Iranian leader Ayatollah Khamenei. He later served as chief advisor to the former Irish President Mary Robinson when she held the position of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Many of you will have your own fond memories of Kevin. To me, Kevin was a friend and a mentor. I particularly remember the peculiar style in which Kevin wrote emails. I came to refer to Kevin's vernacular as Kevinish. I always had the sense that Kevin viewed emails as an annoying inconvenience, an activity which ultimately got in the way of doing the stuff which really mattered, i.e. defending human rights. I also recalled a slight embarrassment Kevin used to display whenever any of us referred to the Essex Mafia, a phrase which has come to be associated with the vast and growing body of Essex human rights alumni who have gone on to profoundly influence the global human rights project. Kevin preferred the term Essex family, but I think many of us recognize a mafia when we see one. However, like so many others, what stands out most distinctly in my memories of Kevin was his absolute and deeply passionate commitment to the cause of human rights. In this and in his commitment to human rights education and to our students, Kevin set an example for the rest of us to seek to emulate and live up to. Some of you, sadly, will have never met Kevin, nor have been directly affected by his human rights activism and teaching. I hope this event will provide you with a sense of what you missed by never having known such a remarkable person. We've scheduled this event for 90 minutes. Mike Chinoy will speak for 15 to 20 minutes. This will then be followed by reflections from each of our panel members. After this, we shall open up the discussion to you, the audience. You won't be able to communicate with us directly via your own microphones, but will of course be able to raise questions throughout the discussion on the Q&A and chat facilities at the bottom of your screen. I will do my best, of course, to set as many questions and to raise as many points as I possibly can. Okay, a little bit now very briefly about the panelists, our esteemed panel. Firstly, of course, the author of this book, Mike Chinoy. As a foreign correspondent for CNN for 24 years, Mike won Emmy, Peabody and Dupont awards for his journalism. While he worked primarily in China and North Korea, he also reported on the troubles in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s. It was during this time that he met Kevin. Mike is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the University of Southern California's US-China Institute and is based in Hong Kong. In addition to Are You With Me?, Kevin Boyle and the Rise of the Human Rights Movement, his books include China Live, People, Power and Television Revolution, Meltdown, The Inside Story of North Korea Nuclear Crisis, and The Last POW. Our next panelist is Tom Hadden. Tom worked with Kevin Boyle from their different communal backgrounds for over 40 years, first on security policies and diplomat court trials in the 1970s, on potential political responses under the Anglo-Irish Agreement in the 1980s, and then on the promised Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. Together, they wrote a series of influential books, research reports, and newspaper articles, and took part in many radio and television programs. He was the first founding editor of the recently revived Fortnight magazine, in which most of their work was first published. Hurst Hannum, our third panelist, is Professor of International Law Emeritus at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, where he has taught human rights law and related courses since 1990. He first collaborated with Kevin Boyle in the early 1970s when they were co-counsel before the European Commission of Human Rights in a case that challenged the widespread practice of torture and ill treatment of suspected IRA members and supporters in Northern Ireland. Hurst's most recent book is Rescuing Human Rights, a Radically Moderate Approach. Finally, last but not least, is our own Aislinn Reedy. He's one of the previously mentioned Essex Mafia, one of our own. Aislinn has served as senior legal advisor at Human Rights Watch since 2006, focusing upon Europe and Central Asia, the Americas, and several African states. She has taught international humanitarian law and human rights law at university level. Previously, Reedy, an Irish barrister, was the director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. She's also worked in The Hague as a trial lawyer in the Office of the Prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. During her career, Aislinn has litigated multiple cases before the European Court of Human Rights and has appeared on behalf of Turkey's Kurdish victims of rights violations. Immediately after the Kosovo War, she worked in Kosovo as a senior human rights analyst for OSCE, where amongst other responsibilities, she worked with families of the disappeared as the head of a victim identification and recovery program. She's a fellow of the Human Rights Centre here at the University of Essex and was a senior research fellow at University College London. She holds a law degree from the National University of Ireland and a master's in international human rights law from the University of Essex. Okay, enough from me. I'm sure you're really eager to hear what Mike has to say about his book and about Kevin's life. Mike, please, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm very, very pleased that we're able to finally have this event. I'm sorry that I'm many thousands of miles away, but it's better to have it this way. I guess we're all used to this now. Let me turn on the share screen so that I can show you some things that I put together about Kevin and the book. As Andrew indicated, Kevin was a charismatic, larger-than-life figure whose life and work reflected and to some extent shaped the emergence of the international movement to defend and expand the protection of human rights. Formed in the battle for civil rights in Northern Ireland, he subsequently became an important figure on the wider international stage. However, many of his greatest achievements took place away from the glare of publicity, and his compelling personal story is curiously unknown. I wrote Are You With Me?, Kevin Boyle and the Rise of the Human Rights Movement to explore his life and legacy and his continued relevance at a time when human rights are increasingly under threat around the world. Met Kevin Boyle in 1972 in my final year as a student at Yale University, and he had come to Yale to be a visiting scholar for the 1972-1973 academic year. Incidentally, I didn't learn how important that year was to his personal and professional evolution until I researched this book. But in any case, as a product of the anti-Vietnam War movement and supporter of the civil rights movement in the States, I had been interested in events in Northern Ireland. And so I convinced him to supervise an independent reading course for me on which we called Topics in Irish History. And so we met once a week for a full academic year. And in the course of this, we became friends. And he also became an intellectual mentor of sorts as I sought to understand events in Ireland. After graduation, I started my journalistic career freelancing in Belfast in the mid-1970s. I would often stay at Kevin's home near the campus of Queen's University, and we remained in touch over many, many years. After Kevin's death from lung cancer in 2010, his wife Joan told me of the archive of his papers that had been donated to NUI Galway. When I took a look at the list of documents, I discovered that there was a PDF file that was 500 pages long that just listed the documents, not a document, the list of the documents. And I thought, there's enough material here to do a book. And so I decided in 2016 to move ahead with this project. It took nearly 4 years perusing thousands of documents and conducting well over 100 interviews to construct a picture of a remarkable man and his time.
My life has been involved within Northern Ireland and the Republic, and now on a much larger plane, on that simple assumption that each human being, whatever their set of beliefs, is entitled by virtue of being a human being to basic human rights.
Kevin liked to use the term the 3 A's to describe himself: activist, advocate, and academic. The battle for civil rights in Northern Ireland was where he began to play all 3 of these roles. He was a young law lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast when, as Andrew mentioned, he helped to found the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association and then the more radical group, the People's Democracy. And I think he became arguably among the dozen most important figures in the Northern Ireland civil rights movement. He was a driving force behind numerous major demonstrations and rallies. This one in October of 1968 is one of the first civil rights protests in Belfast. There's Kevin. For those of you who may remember her, the woman next to him is Bernadette Devlin, who became perhaps one of the most famous figures to emerge from the civil rights protests in Northern Ireland and the student ferment around the world in the late 60s. In any case, like many young people, Kevin was radicalized by the unyielding response of Northern Ireland's unionist-dominated government and police to the demands for change.
When the students and I became involved as a young lecturer in late 68, after the October 5th march in Derry, when the students took to the streets to make a demonstration in Belfast and were blocked from moving and going into the city hall by loyalist groups and by the RUC, it was a great shock to many of them that they couldn't march into the main streets. And they included young Protestant students as well as Catholic students. There was a great deal of innocence at that time.
One of the most controversial early episodes in which Kevin was involved was the famous Long March, a march from Belfast to Derry, organized by the People's Democracy in January of 1969. It was inspired by Martin Luther King's famous march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965, which was a turning point for the US civil rights movement. Kevin can be seen in the 3rd row of marchers on the left here. At Burntalla, 10 miles from Derry, the marchers were attacked by club-wielding Protestant loyalists, including many off-duty police. It was a key moment in the radicalization of Northern Ireland's Catholic minority.
The local committee, on your behalf, made a decision. That decision was that they would not accept any reroute on this march. accept this unjust and tyrannical ban imposed by the discredited unionist government. It is our view that we cannot go forward and accept any reroutes.
As the government met protest with repression, Kevin sought to sustain a non-violent resistance, both to keep up the fight for civil rights, but also to prevent an increasingly alienated minority population from supporting the violent campaign of the Provisional IRA. As Andrew mentioned, I discovered in the course of my research that it turns out that Kevin was the individual who first proposed holding the Civil Rights March in Derry in January 1972 that became Bloody Sunday, not because and this is where British troops shot and killed 13 unarmed demonstrators. This was not because he wanted or expected violence there, but because he saw a peaceful demonstration as a way to express broad opposition to the government's decision to introduce internment without trial that would not involve supporting the violence of the IRA. Indeed, one of Boyle's most consistent positions was unyielding opposition to the use of violence.
I am one who has never, under any circumstances, supported, approved of violence in Northern Ireland. I have always been a believer that it is possible for the two communities to come to a new relationship in equality.
After Bloody Sunday, however, Kevin concluded that the space for the street politics of the previous 4 years had basically disappeared. So he shifted his focus to what would become the defining theme of much of his work from then on, which was to use the law to advance the protection of basic human rights, first in Northern Ireland and then beyond. In 1972, he, along with Hurst Hannum, as Andrew mentioned, brought the first individual cases of torture and mistreatment of Northern Irish detainees by the British authorities to the European Commission on Human Rights in Strasbourg. This was the famous Donnelly Case, about which I hope Hurst can talk a bit more. The Commission and the Strasbourg machinery back then was pretty much in its infancy and was certainly not widely seen at the time as a place that people would immediately think of to seek redress for rights violations. Kevin and Hurst played a key role in changing that. Kevin was an exceptionally modest and unassuming man, and as I conducted my research, I kept discovering his crucial role in a host of other episodes that almost no one knew about, because he just wasn't the kind of guy who talked up, let alone boasted about, his own achievements. One discovery was his crucial role in an ultimately unsuccessful effort to use the Strasbourg machinery to negotiate an end to the IRA hunger strikes in 1980 and 1981. Another discovery was just how influential Kevin was, along with Tom Hadden, in helping to create the intellectual underpinning of the peace process. This included generating key ideas for the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement, ideas that were embraced, as I discovered, by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and helped lead to the breakthrough that produced that deal. And much of that thinking, in turn, provided critical intellectual support for the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. One of the central points that Kevin and Tom pushed was what became in some ways a key guiding principle of both of those agreements. The argument that a key to the solution to end the violence was the formal recognition of Northern Ireland's, the right of Northern Ireland's majority unionists to remain part of the United Kingdom as long as they wished, while acknowledging the right of Northern nationalists to have a legitimate right to express their own Irish identity. Maybe Tom will want to say a few words about this. But Kevin's impact was felt well beyond Northern Ireland. He was the lead lawyer in the case of Geoffrey Dudgeon, a Belfast gay rights activist that decriminalized homosexuality in Northern Ireland, and in turn led to its legalization in the Irish Republic and in other countries, and was even cited in a landmark US Supreme Court decision on gay rights. He conducted major missions for Amnesty International in South Africa during the darkest days of apartheid. In 1986, he became the founding director of a new NGO called Article 19 that was designed to do for freedom of expression what Amnesty International was doing for prisoners of conscience. Boyle's prodigious efforts helped put Article 19 on the map.
Article 19 is both an ideal and an organization. The name comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 19th article of that declaration of 1948, which proclaims everyone's right to freedom of opinion and freedom of expression, the right to hold opinions without interference, without fear, and the right to seek, receive, and impart ideas and information of all kind. That's the ideal, and we took that name as our name of our organization, and our mission is to promote a censorship-free world, to promote that declaration, which most governments, indeed all governments, have in one fashion or another approved of, this Universal Declaration. And our strategy, as all other human rights groups, is to try to get governments to live up to their commitments.
In 1989, Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa, a religious edict, calling for the murder of the Indian-born British novelist Salman Rushdie. In its passions and bloodshed, the Rushdie affair was a foretaste of the mistrust, tension, and conflict that have come to characterize so much of the West's dealings with the Islamic world. Rushdie's Japanese and Italian translators were killed. His Norwegian publisher was shot 3 times but survived. Among writers, publishers, booksellers, and academics, there was an unprecedented climate of fear. Yet just days after Rushdie was targeted, Kevin organized the Committee to Defend Salman Rushdie. Some of you may remember there was an open letter, a famous open letter in support of Rushdie that was signed by thousands of writers, including several who had won or would win the Nobel Prize for Literature. I discovered in the course of my research that this letter was largely Kevin's idea. He did the initial draft, he recruited most of the signatures, and in the scary first few months after Rushdie was targeted, he was the public face of the campaign to support the writer at considerable personal risk. The danger wasn't something that he talked about, but many people who dealt with him over the years would note that in his quiet and unassuming way, Kevin was a man of immense personal courage, for whom defending freedom of expression was the crucial underpinning of all other freedoms. During the 1980s and 90s, Kevin also fought and won several important cases before the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Some were influential in expanding international legal protections for freedom of the press. Others involved scores of cases in Strasbourg on behalf of Kurds from southeastern Turkey who had faced imprisonment, torture, rape, and murder at the hands of the Turkish security forces. One of his colleagues on many of these cases was Aisling Reedy, who had been his student at Essex, as we have just heard. He also worked closely with another Essex person, Francois Hampson, as well as Colchester lawyer Tony Fisher. Despite Turkish government intimidation and obstruction, Kevin, Aisling, Francois, and Tony won most of these cases, which created new legal safeguards for victims of state-sanctioned violence. I found an audio clip of Kevin's appearance before the European Commission of Human Rights in one case. He's telling investigators how a key witness, Hikmet Aksoy, mysteriously disappeared just before Boyle and his colleagues in a team from the European Commission arrived in Turkey hoping to talk to him.
On the hearing in November 1996, the Commission delegates were informed by the government representative that Mr. Hikmet Aksoy, this person who they have asserted in their memorial is a terrorist, was released unconvicted from prison on the very day that the Commission had arrived to hear evidence in the case, and that the government didn't know where he was. He had been in detention for several months prior to that and was awaiting the imminent resolution of his trial on terrorist charges. It has to be said that such a timely release can only be highly unusual.
Everyone I interviewed who had watched Kevin in action in legal proceedings had the same description. They said he was low-key, respectful, non-confrontational, carefully modulated, and extraordinarily effective. And I think you can get a sense of this from this clip I just played. In the early 2000s, Kevin served as the chief advisor to former Irish President Mary Robinson during her tenure as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. That put him at the center of the intense debates that followed the terrorist attacks of September 11th about how to fight terrorism while protecting human rights. This is a tale of high drama and diplomatic intrigue that we don't have time to go into in detail here, but it's all in the book. One of the things about Boyle was his uncanny ability to identify issues and trends earlier than many others, which is why so many of the people I interviewed for my book described him as a visionary. There are numerous fascinating examples. In the late 1980s, for instance, after the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl, and with the growth of HIV/AIDS, he wrote about the crucial link between freedom of expression and public health. Freedom of information is not a luxury, he wrote, but may literally be a matter of life and death. The validity of that observation has only been underscored by the cover-ups and lack of transparency on the part of so many governments around the world in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. In his final years, he identified a series of worrying new challenges. In 2008, for example, he talked about how technology was threatening the right to privacy in a way that could jeopardize human rights. That same year, he also warned about the way huge companies were accumulating information that could also jeopardize personal freedom. This was years before the concern about the political manipulation of the information available on Facebook, Twitter, and social media became a burning international issue. He was indeed ahead of his time. And during all these years, he was also teaching full-time at the Queen's University in Belfast, at NUI Galway, and then for the last 20 years of his life at the University of Essex. And he was instrumental, pioneer in making human rights education central to the teaching of law and in creating human rights centers, first at Galway, and then helping to build the one in Essex, which has achieved the tremendous international reputation it now holds. And in some ways, that may be his most enduring legacy as an inspiration, guide, and mentor to multiple generations of activists who are now carrying on the fight for human rights to which he devoted his life. So let me end there and stop the share screen. And I'm very eager to hear from Kevin's friends and colleagues. Thanks very much.
Mike, thank you. Thank you so much. Just a couple thoughts and a couple reflections from me. I think each of us had our own particular experiences of and relationships with Kevin. Very few of us managed to see Kevin in the round, as it were, all of the various contributions that Kevin had made professionally to the human rights cause. And your book serves an absolutely invaluable, provides an invaluable service, as it were, to giving us all a very clear sense, 360-degree sense really of Kevin's contributions to human rights and the human rights cause. I'd also stress, I think, that the peculiar appreciation that Kevin had for interdisciplinarity. I'm a non-lawyer. I'm surrounded by lawyers, some of whom have an acute sense of interdisciplinarity, others less so. And Kevin, I think, really got and understood interdisciplinarity and the importance of other contributions from colleagues and experts in other fields. So we all miss him greatly, but those areas I think were really important. I had read your book of Kevin's life whilst we were in an extended stay in an Airbnb cottage in Suffolk, and the Airbnb owners had left behind a series of books of sort of Tom Clancy and you know other romantic thrillers and what have you. So I left my copy of your book on the shelves in the hope that other Airbnb residents in this forest in the middle of Suffolk will learn about Kevin's life. So thank you so much for the service that you've done to all of us in writing this particular book. Okay, what we really wanted to do was also to afford an opportunity to the esteemed panel, people who played such a fundamental role in Kevin's life and vice versa, to speak to their experiences, beginning with Aisling, moving on to Hers, and then finally with Tom. So each of you, if you could speak for 5 to 10 minutes, share your reflections, and then we will open up the floor to Q&A and to the wider audience. Aisling, please. I know you have a slightly unstable connection. You're in Mexico, I believe. So let's hope that the connection stays stable. But please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Yes, I will keep my fingers crossed and hope that at least for the next few minutes, the connection remains stable. And so, Mike, I also wanted to say thank you so much for this book. I had various moments. I dipped into when I first read it, I dipped into the parts that I kind of knew, and I was anticipating, waiting to read how they were set up. And then I went back and read about Kevin, who I thought I knew well, until I discovered all these wonderful parts of Kevin that you pulled together in terms of the letters that he'd written, conversations he's had with people that fitted in so well and helped round out what I knew about Kevin, and it made me both smile, and I have to say I shed a couple of tears at various stages. But there are various members of my family who've met Kevin throughout the years, and their Christmas gift was "Are you with me?" So I think the whole extended Reedy family know Kevin a little bit better now, thanks to this really wonderful, fondly accessible, really lovely written book. So thank you for that. And I would say you mentioned that you had met Kevin when he was in his year in Yale, and I didn't fully appreciate as well until I read it just how influential America and American lawyers had been on Kevin's development. I know Hurst is going to speak after me, and I did know about the huge role that Hurst had played in introducing Kevin to the European Convention on Human Rights, and this Kevin, Hurst Hadden, and Michael O'Boyle, who I know is in our audience today. The three boys, as I would fondly call them, the early days of taking cases to the European Court of Human Rights. But I actually also, in a way, ended up meeting Kevin because of an American professor. I was in Dublin finishing my law degree. I really wasn't sure. I wanted to continue with law, but I decided if I was going to do it, it was going to be in this international human rights law field. And a new professor had joined the law faculty in Ireland, who I didn't know. I'd been away for a year. And he said, well, look, if you don't want to be just an academic, if you really want to practice international human rights law, then I suggest you go to the University of Essex, because there they have like practitioners. They have lecturers there who won't just teach you about international human rights law, but they are involved with non-governmental organizations, with the UN. They're activists, and I recommend you go there. And of course I went, and Kevin was the director of the Human Rights Center. And Andrew used the term, he said he sees Kevin as a friend and a mentor. I mean, Kevin was first my teacher, and then my mentor, and then a friend. I'm not even sure at which stage along that happens. And I just want to, in a way, Kevin didn't teach me. In most of my LLM year, Francoise Hampson, who features heavily in the book, was one of my lecturers, and Nigel Rodley. But Kevin I automatically sought out because he was Irish, because I knew of his reputation in terms of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, and there was an immediate bond. But what I was struck about when I was reading your book, Mike, was looking back at comments that former students had made about Kevin when he first joined the faculty in Galway, and how they referred to him. And there was two quotes that you had said. One once talked about how Kevin, that he was able to tell students who were fascinated. They said he basically asked them, what can you do with the law? How can you use the law to change people's lives? And I remember very much when I went to do my LLM, that was exactly what I was looking for. And there was another great quote from someone said that, if he saw you had any promise at all, he just made opportunities for you. And I think that summed up Kevin. If you met him as a student, as many people did, he was so generous with his time, and he automatically, his goal was to open up opportunities to the students who he was teaching and lecturing to, and just giving them great opportunities to do what it was that they wanted to do, and to practice international human rights law. And that is very much how I got taken under Kevin's wing and the wing of Francoise Hampson, and ended up being the junior lawyer who also mentioned that he referred to Kevin's email typos as Kevinish that would come up.
So the dreaded gremlins of Zoom has
trying to take filters off the screen.
Ashton, we're just losing you occasionally as we feared and as we anticipated. Just to let you know, we just missed the last 30 seconds or so.
Okay, thank you. Well, okay, now I'm trying to wonder where to pick up. Let me.
You were speaking about Kevinish. We were sharing. You were
Kevinish. Yes, and I was to say so in the cases that I say in the cases which, so as Mike very eloquently explained, I think it's chapter 21. Mike, he explains how Kevin went to give a lecture down in Diyarbakir in the southeast of Turkey, and began to tell some very young Turkish lawyers, and very young but very brave lawyers, about how they might use the European Convention on Human Rights to tackle the widespread and systematic abuses that were happening in southeast Turkey at the time. And in his telling of it later, he left an application to the European Commission of Human Rights, as it was at the time, too close to a photocopier. And within about 12 months or so, when himself and Francois Sampson were back in the university and back in the Human Rights Center, they began to get these copies of applications to the European Commission of Human Rights on behalf of victims of very serious abuses from Southeast Turkey. And the wonderful thing about Kevin is that for all his travel down to Southeast Turkey, for all the cases that we did and the fact-finding hearings that we did, he never quite managed to get the name of the town or the name of the city quite correct. It's called Diyarbakir, and Kevin would call it Yakabir all the time. And it became so, Kevin's inability to pronounce certain names became quite famous, because as you read in the chapter, the Turkish government did a lot to try to interfere with the victims who were taking the cases to the European Court of Human Rights. And they were very suspicious of this Professor Kevin Boyle, who they had investigated, who they know had been a barrister and had defended people against terrorist charges in Northern Ireland. And they were trying to convince that here he was doing the same thing in the southeast of Turkey a couple of decades later. And they used to make up these scenarios where, you know, Kevin would come in and try to create a situation in order to make Turkey look bad, and this wasn't what was really happening. And we actually had one case in which the government produced a statement where Kevin's alleged client said, well, I was at home mourning the death of my husband when this call came in from this professor in Essex, and he asked me, would I like to take my case to the European Court of Human Rights? And that he was very fond of health workers and the unions, and that he would help me take my case to Strasbourg. And Francoise and myself were in the room, and our eyebrows raised, and we're like, Kevin called you from Essex to Southeast Turkey to help you take your case? And according to our prosecutor, Bekir Selçuk, he said, yes, this is what happened. He called this poor woman who had just lost her husband and told her that he was going to take her case. And we're like, in what language did they communicate? And of course, he'd forgotten to calculate that Kevin not only couldn't speak neither Kurdish nor Turkish, but was very bad at Turkish pronunciations. So we had to tell the European Commission, we will investigate this new allegation. Francois spoke to Kevin and said, Kevin, you didn't by any chance speak to this woman, Mrs. Selma Tanrikulu? Kevin was very perplexed and was like, no, is this a new scenario? So we went back to the commission the next day, and Francois put on the record that Kevin Boyle denied ever speaking to Mrs. Tanrikulu. And the commission said, I think we are all well aware of Kevin's level of Turkish, that we can assume that this is already a proven fact and we don't need any more evidence that this was a completely made up phone call. So I give that as an anecdote, because I don't know even almost where to begin with all the things of the cases. On the cases, there was a photograph both in the book and that you shared there on screen, Mike. And the applicant in that case was a young man called Salih Tekin. And the reason I don't remember him, but I mention it, is because Salih Tekin was a journalist. And throughout all the cases in Southeast Turkey, so it goes back from the days in Northern Ireland to, as you said, his Article 19 days, and through the Kurdish cases, Kevin's commitment to freedom of expression and his particular affinity and admiration of and belief in the importance of the role of the media and freedom of expression and journalists kind of never wavered. And Salih Tekin to him was also a special a special client and a special victim because he had been put in jail and tortured because he was a journalist. And in that hearing, from where that photo was taken, Sally Tekin's father is also in the photo, and he explained to the judges or to the commission delegates that he had been detained because his son was a journalist. And the lead commission said, yes, but why were you detained? And the old man said, because my son is a journalist. And he said, yes, no, but you, I know your son's a journalist, why were you detained? And the old man said, because my son is a journalist. And this went on, and eventually Kevin interrupted and said, sir, I don't think you understand. He was detained because his son is a journalist. And as I said, I remember Kevin was very determined that when we left that hearing for photographs, that we were going to win, Sally Tekin's case for him, and indeed we did. I think I've probably maybe been talking enough. I have beside me actually a lot of anecdotes about different cases from Kevin, but I think I will let the others speak, and I will come back and maybe fill in later if I'm allowed. So back to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you. We have questions already coming in through the chat facility. We'll get to those in due course. Thank you so much, Hurst. The audience, the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you very much. And first, let me apologize. I disappeared for about 10 minutes or so. I'm not sure if that showed up on the screen, but the technical issues, I hope, are fixed for at least the moment. First, I want to say how wonderful it is to be back in touch, albeit only virtually, with Tom and Mike and Aisling. We've all shared many glasses of Guinness and other beverages together over the years, and one of these days it would be nice to make this reunion a real one rather than a virtual one. Let me begin by, I suppose, disagreeing with something that Mike said, because he described Kevin as larger than life. Kevin was certainly charismatic. I never had the opportunity to see him actually use a bullhorn, but those little clips, I'm sure, gave a very good idea of the impact he could have on a crowd. But to me, one of the most striking things about Kevin, and this does come through in the book in part, is that he wasn't larger than life. He was an ordinary, charming, extraordinary, intelligent, dedicated human being, but who was never out for himself. I don't know where his sense of social justice came from his upbringing in Newbury, of course, but it was much broader than that. And we all know that the Irish are charming. Aisling is certainly, and well, I was going to say Aisling and Tom, but let's say Aisling is certainly an example of that. But Kevin could be a charmer. At the same time, it was real. He didn't just try to get on someone's good side. He was one of the most honest people I'd ever met. And apart from the agenda of making things better, I don't think he had a hidden agenda. As he mentioned in one of the clips, Mike, what's remarkable about human rights is that they are for all people everywhere in the world. And he cared about human rights for all people everywhere in the world. Yes, he had a particular affection for freedom of expression, perhaps freedom of religion, but his work ranged from gay rights to China, to South Africa, to the Kurds. And he, in that case, was a true universalist. We all could talk for a long time about Kevin, so let me just say a word or two about the first case that he ever took to the European system, which was the Donnelly case back in 1972. Kevin, for many years, would claim that I taught him everything he knew about the European system. That was clearly not true, but I do take a little bit of credit for at least introducing him to the system as a freshly graduated young American lawyer who, for some reason, had become interested in Northern Ireland without any Irish background, and interested in the European system, even though he wasn't European. And so that was jointly our first European case. Kevin, of course, was unequaled in his knowledge and his use of that system. Kevin was also a wonderful politician with a small p. He had very good sense. And I'll just give my own little anecdote and then leave it there. The Donnelly case was the only case that actually managed to get as far into the European system, the only individual case as opposed to the Irish government case, to get so far along in the system that the 3 European commissioners came to Belfast and to the UK to hear something like 40 witnesses. And one of the dilemmas that we were faced with very early on was that the security witnesses were not identified to us, and they were hidden behind screens. And we protested and said, why is this? Do you think we're IRA stooges? But the British wouldn't budge. And my reaction was that we should simply at that stage pull out of any participation and say that this was an entirely unfair hearing. Kevin, as I say, was the better politician, and he came up with the perfect compromise, and that was a 2-sentence statement that we would make whenever one of these security officials was called, saying something like, because we are unable to either identify or see these people testifying, we refuse to participate in the cross-examination, since these were all witnesses brought by the British government. This, much to my surprise at least, perhaps not Kevin's, resulted in effectively the 3 commissioners who were hearing the case serving as our counsel, because once the British got finished with their examination, the commissioners themselves would begin to ask questions. There came a time when we knew we were on good ground, because one of the witnesses was asked how a prisoner in his custody had received a black eye. And the prison officer, in all seriousness, said, well, I don't know, I wish I could still do my Irish accent, but I can't any longer, said he must have fallen against a door. And then we all knew what was coming next. The commissioners then asked, but he had 2 black eyes. Do you know how he got the second? And even the prison officer couldn't give the answer with a straight face, but he did say, I guess he fell against 2 doors. While we ultimately lost this case on procedural grounds because our clients had received compensation without admission of any responsibility from the British government, the commissioners did state very clearly that there was an administrative practice of ill treatment and cover-up of IRA suspects throughout Ireland, thus at least affirming, although not in a formal way, our basic approach. Kevin was also a lot of fun, and we probably can't, since this is being recorded, go into all the ways in which we might say that. But the only time that Kevin and I lived within thousands of miles of one another was those first 2 or 3 years in Belfast. But from Geneva to Strasbourg to Galway to Colchester to San Francisco to Boston to Hong Kong, we stayed in touch over the years. He was one of my closest friends, and certainly someone that we all should look to as a model of the people that we would want to be, both for what he did, but also because of the way he did it and his unassuming way of leading and of mentoring. We can get into more substance later, but it's just, again, a real treat to be here with you and to be able to talk without Guinness about Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those reflections. Guinness sounds good, and it would have been so nice to have gotten together in some bar or other, somewhere or other, after this event, as you say, at another time, I'm sure. Hurst, thank you. Tom, events in Northern Ireland are fluid, perhaps is one way of describing it. Your particular professional relationship with Kevin is so heavily focused upon Northern Ireland and the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. Really keen to hear your reflections upon Kevin and Kevin's life. Tom, over to you. Tom, you're still muted. You performed the Zoom faux pas that we all succumb to every now and then.
That better?
Perfect.
Good. Okay. Yes, Kevin has been gone for 10 years now, and that's my main concern in a sense, because over the 40 years or so, Kevin was always there when you rang him up to talk through some of the issues that kept arising in Northern Ireland and more generally in relation to human rights. So that's sad, but I've got a suggestion at the end. Perhaps that might help that. The book describes us as an intellectual partnership, but it doesn't quite get to the issues on which we disagreed. I was always much more interested in outcomes rather than legal cases. Kevin was committed, in a sense, to taking cases to human rights and legal cases as the way in, where I was always more interested in the politics and in engaging politically on the issues. In a sense, my view is that the work that Kevin and I did with the two governments in the run-up to the Anglo-Irish Agreement was the best thing that we did. It didn't involve law in any way at all, but it involved engaging with the two governments to persuade them that it was their job to look after a terrible place like Northern Ireland and to avoid themselves contributing to the problems by taking different stances on behalf of the unionist and the nationalist peoples. And that came out also in our approach or our views on the Turkish cases. My view on the Northern Ireland cases was, yeah, this is all very well. These cases at Strasbourg, were great fun for the lawyers, but they didn't actually make much difference on the ground in Northern Ireland. And it wasn't until the two governments got together and started to develop the supervision of Northern Ireland on a joint basis that things began to get a bit better. Kevin once came over to Belfast. I encouraged him to come and talk to the students in our human rights class about the Turkish cases. And the message he gave us was he was very disappointed with the political effect or ineffect of all these cases. Yes, of course, some of the victims were getting handouts of money, were getting compensation, but the cases were not really affecting the way in which the Turkish military and the Turkish government dealt with the Kurds. That didn't begin to happen until the European Union began to engage politically with the Turkish government with a view to Turkey joining the European Union, European Community and Union. And when that has ceased to be a realistic prospect, things have got an awful lot worse in Turkey, and all the human rights lawyers in the world are not really managing to deal with it. So just a cautionary tale that sometimes focusing exclusively on human rights rather than on how to deal with the particular problems of the particular place, like Northern Ireland or the Kurds in Turkey or the Israelis and the Palestinians. To deal with those things, you need politics, not law. Similarly, on the Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, Kevin was always very keen to have a Bill of Rights that reflected the international human rights consensus. I kept saying, hang on a moment, look, we've got particular problems here in Northern Ireland that we need to put into the Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. And as most of you know, that project has failed. There is no Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. And my view of it is that it was because the human rights community overreached themselves. They say, let's have the best Bill of Rights in the world. Let's incorporate absolutely everything. Whereas what we really needed in Northern Ireland was something much shorter and sweeter and focused on the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland. That got lost when the human rights people moved in. So that's the kind of differences that Kevin and I had. He was also, as Mike and others have said, he was also very cautious. At various times, I had to push him to allow me to say things bluntly that possibly Kevin would not have wanted to say. That came out in the first Penguin that we wrote. That we on the day that Maggie Thatcher said out, we were meeting with the Penguin editorial team, and I was gung ho for accepting the offer to write a Penguin political special book on Northern Ireland. Kevin was quite cautious about it, and I had to to push him to agree to do this. The other thing that I sometimes say, which perhaps but shouldn't be said, that Kevin didn't write any big books himself. He relied on other people like me and like Juliet Sheen to deal with the big book on freedom of religion, like David Beatham to do with the audit. And Kevin's role was in encouraging and facilitating and commenting on what other people were producing under his guidance. And that brings me just to a last little point, more positive one, just saying this is, I think, the fifth or possibly even the sixth time that I've been rolled out to talk about Kevin and the relationship that we had politically and otherwise. I would like to see the Human Rights Centre in Essex producing a collection of Kevin's own words, Kevin's own proposals on how you run a human rights center, on how you deal with these things. Let's not have more and more of people like us turning up and talking about Kevin. Let's have a collection of Kevin's best writings, and then we can all enjoy them. That's it. Thank you. I'm off to Portadown to. Well, I've reinvented the magazine that we published in, and we're trying to say sensible things now about the situation in Northern Ireland. Whether anybody will pay any attention is quite another matter, but it's to do with not focusing exclusively on legal cases, but just trying to see if we could assist in finding some sort of a better political development. Thank you.
Tom, thank you so much, and thank you again for sharing your thoughts this 5th or 6th time now, and reflections upon Kevin's life and your relationship with Kevin. A couple of comments from me. I think it's, you know, so I have a German mother and a second generation Irish father, and grew up in London on a council estate in London in the 70s. And I think people who didn't know Britain in the 70s and 80s wouldn't possibly begin to imagine how great was the hostility and the outright racism actually towards the Irish community in London and across the UK. So with a German mother and a second generation and a surname such as Fagan, I kind of got it from both angles, because as we know, the English are not particularly keen on the Germans or the Irish. So I think that's a really important point, and to see the sheer levels of unpopularity that Kevin and yourself, Tom, would have been subjected to in the work that you were doing. I think it's
and don't forget that the Unionist population in Northern Ireland is now feeling those same feelings of rejection, and it needs to be attended to. Absolutely,
Tom, indeed, absolutely. I think a second point I'd like to make, a reflection I'd like to make on your comments about Kevin is the connection between politicking and morality. Kevin was, like so many of us working, if not all of us working in the human rights field, was motivated by deep moral convictions, but also was very, very conscious of the need to deploy pragmatic political instruments and means to achieve, to pursue those moral goals. I wonder sometimes if sometimes the human rights, sections of the human rights community have become overly focused upon morality at the expense of actually getting stuff done. That's my own comment. And Tom, I heard you very clearly. We'll think about how we can provide a more lasting, permanent testimony to Kevin in due course in the Human Rights Centre. So thank you.
In his own words, not people like me and Hurst and you and everybody else doing it. Print his own stuff.
Absolutely, Tom. I hear you loudly and clearly. Thank you so much. So look, we have half an hour or so now for questions, for comments. We've had some already come in. Some of the contributions to the chat have been people saying hi and thank you so much for your respective presentations. I'll hopefully be able to get to many of the questions. Forgive me if I'm not able to pose your particular question to the panel. I will do my best, of course, depending upon how many questions continue to come in. So we have one from Matthew Pieter. Great presentation, Mike, and a great book on Kevin. I worked with Kevin under Article 9 when Article 19 was founded during the heady days of the Salman Rushdie campaign, and helped him to edit the first report on freedom of information in 1988. Can you comment more on the relevance of Kevin's overall legacy today in terms of freedom of information? Mike, over to you.
Well, I think it goes beyond just freedom of information, although as Kevin often said, that was a kind of underpinning of everything else that he believed in. You know, human rights has had a pretty rough ride in the last decade or so. You look at everything from what's happened in Turkey to where I'm living here in Hong Kong, to the Trump era in the States, to the Brexit and Britain looking to abandon some of the European human rights institutions, to the emergence of sort of neo-authoritarian governments in Eastern Europe, to the Philippines. It's a pretty grim picture. And there've even been, there was an article a few years ago that somebody in the headline was "The End of Human Rights." So it's bleak, and I don't know that there was a specific sort of press this or that button in relation to Kevin, but I think a couple of the lessons from his life. I think it was very clear to me in doing the research for the book that he understood that human rights can never be taken for granted. There was, I can't remember which case it was, but I found notes that he gave for a lecture to students. It was a case that they lost. Maybe Hearst, it was the case involving the bombing of the Serbian TV station during the
Mankovic.
the war, former Yugoslavia, the NATO war in former Yugoslavia. And he said there, he said, we lost that case, but that's a battle. It's not the whole war, and somewhere down the road, you know, other people will pick this up. So I think he kind of understood that part of this is just showing up and keeping the fight. That you're never gonna win in the. I mean, in 2008, you know, he talked about acknowledging, look around the world, great many countries don't enjoy human rights. And that you have to just fight for it over and over and over again, and accept that you know, you're climbing a mountain that you're never going to reach the top of. But as long as you're trying to put one foot after another and work on the issues and move forward when you can, and that it requires using the law, but I think he did come to appreciate the importance of, as Tom mentioned, of political engagement and of inspiring the next generation, and not to give up even when things are bleak. So that, I think, would be the takeaway. Not a specific sort of formula, but an attitude to look at how to carry on.
Thank you, Mike. And just again, to add my own reflection on that, Kevin's contribution to the establishment of the Emmy and the theory and practice of human rights was partly motivated by that, or largely motivated, as my understanding is, to address that need to take education out into the actual world, take human rights education out into the actual world outside of academia, which, as we know, then and now still can be something of an ivory tower and disconnected from the real world. So Kevin's contribution there was momentous in so many ways. Right, thank you. I have a question from Michael O'Boyle. Hi, Michael. Thank you for joining us. And it's a question for Hurst. Hurst, perhaps you should explain how Kevin was dudgeoned after his Strasbourg victory before the Commission, and Francis Keenan also.
Very few people understand the word dudgeoned, but it comes from the name of really Kevin's first non-political prisoner freedom of speech case, Dudgeon against the UK, which was already alluded to, which established that homosexuals have the same rights in Northern Ireland as they did in the rest of the UK. It also demonstrates to some extent Tom's concerns about politics. Jeffrey Dudgeon, everything Kevin did was for free. Of course, he had a paying job, but nonetheless, these were things that he didn't have to do. He successfully developed the strategy and argued the case at the first level in those days of the human rights system in Europe, which was the Commission, which decided in Dudgeon's favor that yes, there could be no discrimination against homosexuals. But then in this case, the gay politicians took over, or at least the politically aware gay people who fired Kevin in between the Commission and the court, so that they could make it a less legal and more political issue, and also take some credit for it. Kevin obviously didn't appreciate it, which is where, and I can't remember whether he or in fact Michael O'Boyle came up with the verb dudgeoned, but it applied in several other places as well. And it comes back to what I said earlier about Kevin being in some ways an ordinary man, and that's not the right word, but he was a man of great humility. I don't think he was uncertain, because he was a very, very good lawyer. But as Mike just said, it's a long struggle. It's going to be ongoing. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some. Sometimes all you can do is raise the questions, which is what we did in the Bankovich case about the bombing. Kevin supported the bombing of Kosovo and Serbia. I opposed it. Others on the team, Tony Fisher, who I'm afraid was about to leave, Francois Hampson, the late Voyan Dimitrievich in Serbia, all had different views, but we thought it was important to try to say that human rights still survived, even during armed conflict. We lost the case miserably. It was 19-0 in the Grand Chamber. Of course, we were up against a team of lawyers from at least 11 or 12 other countries. We may have set a record in that respect. But the criticism against the decision, which was really quite outrageous, has led the court in subsequent years to modify a lot of what they said in Bankovich. I don't know what the answer is in terms of what the relationship should be in the European court between human rights and humanitarian law. But it's an issue that certainly deserved to be raised. And even though it was a defeat, I think both Kevin and I, while we were disappointed, were at the same time satisfied that we'd given them a good run and that we'd laid the groundwork for better things to come.
Thank you. That's interesting to focus on cases and the value of cases, because it's another question, comment that Michael Boyle has raised, and he asked, could the panelists please comment on Tom's point about human rights cases being the wrong direction to take? Of course, human rights cases do not solve political problems, but they do highlight important grievances that politicians must address to achieve improvements. I don't know which of you, Ashton, maybe you wanted to, given the focus of your career on legal cases and using the law, perhaps you wanted to comment on that.
Sure, I'll try and hopefully be able to hear me. Of course, Tom, I can't speak to how you and Kevin discussed legal cases in Northern Ireland at the time, but for me, Kevin, far from it, actually never saw taking a legal case as the end of itself. That taking a case was a legal tool and a strategy which provided a sense of objectivity and facts. And this is very important, Kevin, getting your facts right and being able to have a framework in which then everybody can come in and have the discussion and find solutions and have a framework and a baseline to solve solutions in this, interdisciplinary way that you mentioned that he. But so for, Kevin, I think, and it's the transition about when he discovers that maybe going to Strasbourg and using the Strasbourg machinery and framework was a way of creating a new dynamic in the Northern Ireland situation. I think that's it. We were all frustrated, sometimes with the Commission, sometimes with the court, that the cases that we took in Turkey were having a very slow drip effect. And yes, they weren't revolutionary in terms of how they changed the course of events for the Kurds in Southeast Turkey. But I go back to Turkey now, in my capacity for Human Rights Watch, and I have my colleague who's head of our Human Rights Watch office there. And those lawyers who were in jail or worked with us, one of the lawyers is in the photographs, Osmir Baydemir, went on to be the mayor of Diyarbakir, and his wife, and that they were lawyers who did take the law into politics, and sometimes in a way that was or was not helpful for cases. But I think Kevin very much saw cases as a way of creating a baseline and a framework with it to talk about political solutions and where you go, and not to allow politicians off the hook, that they couldn't start kind of being overly political and just come up with pragmatic solutions that ignored the core value system, which had been litigated, and where courts had said, this is something that matters. This is the this is the right, this is the value. And for him, that gave people, Kevin, and again, it was one of the quotes that had jumped out at me. Kevin was very much about showing how the law could empower people. So it's never about law for law's sakes or the cases for the case, but about how you could use the law to empower ordinary people. And I think it was maybe Conor Geraghty, in fact, who ironically, maybe Tom, like you, Conor's less of a lawyer in some ways, or less enamored with the law. But for me, Kevin, as I said, I don't think Kevin, and one reason maybe why he didn't continue just to be a barrister, but went into very much academics, went into human rights centers, which he saw the discussion in terms of setting up something in Galway and then go to the University of Essex, was very much being able to combine multidisciplinary skills in problem solving, but where the law could be a key component of that gave a sense of objectivity and something that politicians couldn't ignore because it was inconvenient anymore, and the rule of law. So I take a very different, lesson, if you like, from Kevin and his decision to litigate and how we litigated the cases, albeit it is totally true that the level of pace of transformation and the need for systemic change was frustratingly slow. But I think Kevin would have, if you suggested to Kevin that he exclusively took human rights cases, exclusively or overly focused on human rights cases to the detriment of other problem-solving skills, I think he would have been a little bit put out by that. It's not the Kevin that I knew.
Just a quick comment, if I'm allowed.
Mm.
I'm not against taking cases. I mean, they raise issues and so on, but they don't always create the kind of transformational political solutions. At the moment, I'm involved with what we call the Belfast Guidelines on Amnesty and Accountability, and Hurst is with us on that, I think, which is just raising the issue of whether or not the demand for justice for victims is the key objective in achieving human rights, or whether or not there are some ways in which the demand for individual justice for those who have suffered physical damage gets in the way of the peace talks and the way in which governments and NGOs and others can work towards a political solution. So the Belfast Guidelines, which I should add are widely ignored in Belfast, are suggesting that there are ways in which you can balance the rights of individuals who have been killed or who have suffered injury against the societal problem of widespread inequality. And it's not entirely clear who you take your case against when you're trying to achieve greater equality from different communities in different places. That's just a thought. I'm not sure if Hurst is still happy with the Belfast Guidelines. I hope so.
Hurst, I'm sure you wanted to comment more broadly, but also in response to Tom's question.
An easy response to Tom is yes. I think the guidelines are extremely thoughtful and useful, both as a matter of law and as politics, in terms of how we can deal with mass atrocities and at the same time not render societies totally dysfunctional. But I do think this is an important issue, and I think Kevin would be absolutely delighted at this discussion. And for me, the key is simply to distinguish between law and politics, even though they're very closely related. One of the things we do often forget is what Aisling raised about law making it possible to find the facts. Now, that isn't always going to be possible, depends on the circumstances. But law is not just an op-ed piece. It isn't just a tweet. It isn't just somebody's opinion. The purpose of law, whether it's in ordinary civil cases or something much grander, is to find out first what really happened. The second thing I think that international human rights law does is to provide a clear and accepted, at least in theory by states, moral and ethical framework within which political action should be taken. Of course, the law isn't enough. And I think Tom is absolutely right that a bill of human rights for Northern Ireland would not have done much to resolve the conflict, and probably wouldn't do much even if it were in place today. Because politics deals with different kinds of social, economic, and political issues that are different from rights that people have. I think this has to do with constitutional structures. It has to do with the environment. It has to do with how we end racism, as opposed to just saying that racism is illegal. And so we need both. I think that the reason that Tom and Kevin wrote such terrific books is that they had these discussions, I suspect, all the time, although I was never party to any of them. The reason that Human Rights Watch has been so influential over the years is that it really started off, in my view at least, as a US foreign policy lobbying group. And it gradually grew into human rights, but it never lost that link between policy and rights. But we can't look to rights to resolve every social problem that a community faces. And we can't leave it solely to politics to do what the majority wants, because the one without the other is just as likely to lead to an unjust or a dysfunctional society as, and that's why the two have to be not joined, but used in the proper way to achieve different results that both lead to not only guaranteeing the rights of everyone in the world, but helping to create good societies that reflect what those societies want. And that's where we can't do without the politics and shouldn't do without the law.
Thank you. Just following on from that, there's a comment from Claire Thomas, which says a comment, not a question. I think grappling with Tom's question is maybe what led Kevin to become chair of Minority Rights Group, exactly to look into achieving those equality issues. Perhaps Hurst can confirm that, or otherwise, did anybody else on the panel?
Well, certainly in terms of equality issues, that's true. I think Kevin did both things. I joined the Minority Rights Group Council just after he was elected. I figured I owed it to him, and it got me to London twice a year. So what could be wrong with that? But Kevin also, I think, invigorated the small legal team within Minority Rights Group. So Minority Rights Group is very much a successful advocacy organization, but also has taken some very influential cases, particularly dealing with indigenous groups in Africa. So it perhaps is an example of what Kevin would like to do and did most of his life, which was to be a lawyer first, but also never to forget the politics. And there I'm very much on Aisling's side as well. And I don't think Tom ever said that Kevin ignored politics. After all, he was out in the streets for 4 years until he figured out that something else was needed too.
A light-hearted comment, but an important one, that Essex has spawned a number of relationships and partnerships, and I'm sure there are many children out there as a consequence of the connections that were formed between various Essex people. We have a comment from Natasha Pieter. My husband, Matthew Pieter, the co-editor with Kevin of the Freedom of Information book from his time as publications director for Article 19, has already spoken. But I would like to add the human aspect, the fact that Kevin was also great at matchmaking. He introduced me to Matthew, and we've been married now for nearly 34 years. Natasha, I assume there are children and maybe even grandchildren that Kevin has had a role in, so to speak. Thank you for that sort of light-hearted contribution. Mike, I really wanted to sort of bring this discussion to a gentle close, and ask you whether there were things from your research that particularly stood out, that surprised you. You would have, of course, had a sense of Kevin, the person, the contributions that he made across the human rights field. Was there anything that you found particularly surprising, that particularly stood out? Well,
I mean, one thing, as I sort of referred to earlier on, I knew Kevin was an important figure, and I knew even in the early mid-70s when I would stay at his place in Belfast that he was an important figure. But I was absolutely flabbergasted to discover how important he was on so many issues in so many places. Something happened and he just somehow kept sort of popping up in the middle of the action, but never letting on to anybody that he was in the middle of the action. And sometimes, I mean, for example, I had no idea that he had tried to use the Strasbourg machinery to find a negotiated way out of the IRA hunger strikes. And the only way that I found out about that was that chatting with Joan, who was, I have to say, a source of immense support and guidance and hugely helpful. She mentioned in passing, they used to have this wonderful place in the outside Galway in Connemara they would go to. And she mentioned that in the summer of '83, she got a call, I think it was from the wife of Irish Prime Minister Garret Fitzgerald, making some reference to an airplane possibly being on standby to take Kevin and Frances Keenan to Strasbourg. And that got me asking questions. And it turns out that he and his colleague Frances Keenan had brought a case in the previous year on behalf of one of the first round of IRA hunger strikers who did not die to Strasbourg. All the elements of the case, except one or two, were thrown out, and these two were sort of adjourned. And when Garret Fitzgerald became a Taoiseach, he was desperate to find a way out of the hunger strike, and they kind of the court agreed to look at these cases again, and that opened the door to the court becoming a kind of using its good offices to mediate a resolution of the conflict. And there were hopes that Kevin and Frances, representing a couple of the hunger strikers, could then talk to the British without anybody losing face. In the end, Margaret Thatcher vetoed it. But I was just a passing reference. So there, over and over, this kind of thing happened. The other thing I think I would just say is about Kevin personally is he really, he felt things very deeply, and he really struggled, I think, with feelings of whether or not his role in, and I write about this in the book, his role in the civil rights movement might have made him unwittingly responsible for some of the horrible things that happened afterwards. He was, as that clip I played showed, adamantly against violence, and he hated the provisional IRA, and he came up with a political position with Tom at the end that said you have to recognize the legitimacy of the Protestant concerns in the North, and as a first step toward, while acknowledging the legitimacy that nationalists can articulate aspiration to an Irish identity. But he was haunted by this, and even in his final months, I found emails with a former student where he wrestled with, did he bear some responsibility? So he's a guy who really felt things he wasn't cavalier about stuff. He took things very seriously and felt things very, very deeply. And I mean, I thought I knew him well. I knew him for 40 years, but there were sides of him that obviously didn't come out in the, times we were together, that I was able to put together from this process. And I found that very moving as an experience to sort of, I've written 4 books, but this is the first biography I've ever written. And it's a daunting challenge to try and write a fair and balanced biography of some, you're writing about a person and you're trying to get beyond just, he did this, he said that. And that was something that struck me.
Mike, thank you. We listen, we could talk for hours, I'm sure. And as I say, over a glass or several, Guinness would be preferable, but unfortunately that can't happen. I'm just going to close with a few important comments and a few important statements. Mike, I've learned a huge amount about Kevin's life. I knew Kevin for about 10 years. People on this call knew him for much longer. I'm sure everybody on this call, everyone in the audience had their own particular experiences of Kevin, but your book, as I say, provides such a absolutely indispensable 360-degree account of the significance of Kevin. So thank you so much for writing it. It's out there, everyone. It's out there in good bookshops. There is a link in the chat to Red Lion Bookstore, which is our local independent bookseller, award-winning bookseller in Colchester. To those of you who are in campus or in Colchester and able to get back out into the so-called real world. For the rest of us, it's available obviously through reputable online booksellers. I shan't mention any names, obviously. I wanted just to say, I suppose by way of closing, so thank you so much for Ashlyn, to Hurst, to Tom, thank you for sharing your time with us, really massively appreciate it. I'd like to thank Kat Freeman and her team for making this possible, for helping us overcome some of the inevitable technical challenges and gremlins that strike any Zoom call. And I think also, just to sort of close really finally from me, is a comment from my colleague, who's the co-deputy director at the Human Rights Centre, Jude Bueno de Mesquita. So Jude says in the chat, thank you for such wonderful presentations. Kevin was also my mentor, and whilst at Essex was encouraged me to think outside the box. And I'm proud to teach the module at Essex on human rights and development, which Kevin indeed set up some years before it became a fashionable issue. I just wanted to add that it's a real shame that we can't meet for a post-panel party. So I wanted to propose that we raise a virtual glass. I have a virtual coffee cup, a virtual glass to Kevin, our teacher, colleague, friend, and inspiration.
And to Joan.
And to Joan. Joan, you're out there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone. It's been a huge pleasure. Tom, we will do our utmost to meet your particular proposal in Kevin's own words. Thank you, everyone. Have a good week. Take care. Thank you again. Goodbye.